Good afternoon and welcome to our four-part series, Let's Talk Poultry, in collaboration with Alltech Ireland. My name is Rebecca Tierney and I'm a Poultry Advisor within Teagasc. The aim of this series is to develop a knowledge transfer platform for our Irish poultry farmers, which will educate them on our selected topics. So today we're going to begin with how we can mitigate bird flu through improving biosecurity measures on farm. We have two excellent speakers today, Joe Flaherty and James Greaves. On Wednesday the 17th of June, Professor Steve Collett will go through the do's and don'ts for chick start and how to give them the best start in life. Wednesday the 1st of July, we'll see Martin Humphreys and Padraig McKenna talk us through the laying cycle and how we can improve this from the very beginning right through to egg production. And to finish up, we will have Peter Duggan and Rory Mannion from Board BIA to give us an outlook on the Irish poultry industry. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you all for joining us today. I just want to draw your attention to the question and answer box at the bottom of your screens. I'd like to ask you to send any questions you have for either James or Joe to this, and we will go through them at the end of our webinar. Today's webinar is going to be recorded and will be shared on the Teagasc website in the coming days. I'm going to invite Niall Brennan from Alltech to introduce himself and to introduce our speakers.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. And again, I'd like to welcome everyone on the webinar. We've had a fantastic response with nearly 300 people registered for today. So this shows the need and the want for this type of information within the industry. So to introduce myself, my name is Niall Brennan. I graduated from University College Dublin with a degree in agricultural science in 2014. I then went on and joined Alltech that summer, and I've been there since. Currently, I am the Poultry Coordinator for Alltech Ireland. For you that may haven't have heard of Alltech, Alltech was originally set up by Dr. Pierce Lyons at Dundalkman, and it is now home to nearly 6,000 people operating in over 120 countries across the world. Our main mission is getting as much from the animal's genetic potential as possible through natural feed solutions. So that's me and that's Alltech. I would now like to introduce our two speakers. So first up we have Joe Flaherty. Joe graduated from the Veterinary College of Ireland in 1986. He then went on to work in a number of mixed practices across Ireland and the UK. In 1992, Joe joined the Department of Agriculture, where he is there today, and holds the visit of Division for Veterinary Public Health and for Pig and Poultry Health. As James is over 30 poultry in. Originally, he was a broiler producer for Cappoquin chickens and can be as a the world. I'd like to go now to come on and to deliver his presentation.
Thanks very much, Niall, and thank you for the opportunity to make this presentation today, and thanks to everybody who's joining us. I'm just going to, hopefully the technology bears with me now. I'm just opening my presentation. So I've been under fairly strict instructions to stick to a maximum of 20 minutes for this, so apologies if I fly through some of this presentation, but I'll make sure I finish in 20 minutes. So my talk is in relation to current outbreak of avian influenza, low pathogenic in Ireland, and biosecurity. So it's kind of divided into two halves. So first slide, what is avian influenza? Most of you will be familiar with much of this content. So it's a highly contagious, often fatal viral disease of poultry and wild birds. The actual impact depends on the particular subtype that you're dealing with. Wild birds have traditionally been the reservoir of infection and the source of spread into Ireland, and they transmit infection through respiratory secretions and through their feces. Certain subtypes can affect humans and mammals, usually if there's close contact, and we take particular care in relation to the H5 and H7 subtypes, the high pathogenic subtypes, when talking about human contact. Avian influenza then is classified in legislation based on its pathogenicity and its notifiability. So pathogenicity, in other words, how damaging it is to the bird, it's divided into two groups. High pathogenic avian influenza, a serious disease, spreads rapidly and causes high mortality. And low pathogenic avian influenza, generally a mild disease, which can actually go undetected, and particularly so in non-table egg laying flocks or non-laying flocks. Notifiability, all of the subtypes of AI are actually notifiable in Ireland under our legislation, under our statutory instrument, but they're not all notifiable under EU law. So the EU law makes a distinction between the high pathogenic H5, H7, any subtype of H5, H7, and any high pathogenic subtype of the others. So that's that point. Just in relation to clinical signs of avian influenza, I'm not going to dwell on this, but just to say, you can see there's a long list of clinical signs there that are associated with the high pathogenic, ranging from depression to diarrhea, sudden death, a range of clinical signs. With low path AI, as I said earlier, these are mild symptoms generally, and sometimes actually unnoticed, apart from the drop in egg production, which generally is picked up. What are the risk pathways of avian influenza? Well, how does the disease become introduced into poultry and wild birds in Ireland? You can see there are risks there in terms of the introduction of live poultry and hatching eggs. That's a lower risk, we would consider it, because of the regulatory controls that are in place. Also, sources of contamination would include contaminated feed, bedding, transport vehicles, etc. Again, because of regulatory controls, this is generally speaking thought to be a lower risk, but I think in the current context, we have to look very closely now at all forms of biosecurity risk, and I would be suggesting that the sector needs to look closely at all of these risks as being, a potential major contributing factor in the current outbreak. Traditionally, as I said, migratory wild birds are the source of infection for Ireland, and I suppose given the particular topography of Cavan Monaghan area, you can see why wild birds will settle in that area and are a particular risk, and also the fact that we have such a high concentration of poultry in that area, farmed poultry. The migratory patterns of wild birds, that's a diagram of the various patterns that have been described across the world. I'm just going to focus on one in the next slide, which is the East Atlantic flyway. And you can see the yellow line there is the limits of that flyway. So you can see the various breeding grounds up in the north, Greenland, Iceland, Russia, wintering sites in West Africa and so on. And some of these birds are migrating huge distances, up to 10,000 kilometers, with stopovers on the way. So that's something that we can't escape. That migratory pattern is well established, and Ireland lies within it. We have high numbers of migratory waterfowl. There's some pictures of them there at the bottom of this slide. And as I said, they congregate on wetland sites, and there can often be large multi-species flocks, and they bring with them the potential to infect resident birds. So the bottom line on that slide, our national flock is at constant risk for AI introduction, and that's something we have to learn to live with as an industry. Okay, a few points in relation to the current outbreak, the H6N1 outbreak in Northern Ireland, first of all, because it was identified first in Northern Ireland. They have had a total of 15 cases in Northern Ireland. The affected flocks include table egg layer flocks, broiler breeders, and one grandparent level flock as well. Fortunately for them, the last outbreak was reported on the 22nd of March, and they haven't had a report since then. And the area that was affected, you can see, is contiguous to the Cavan Monaghan area, Fermanagh, Tyrone, Armagh, and County Down as well. The clinical presentation in the north of Ireland was very similar to what we've seen here. Generally mild clinical signs. They did report greenish diarrhea in a number of instances, but that wasn't a uniform issue across all of these cases. And all of those flocks have now been depopulated. Turning then to Ireland, all the cases so far have been identified in County Monaghan. We have currently confirmed 10 table egg layer flocks, 2 commercial, 8 free range, and 2 fattening turkey flocks. And there is 1 additional flock which is just going through the process, and in fact was confirmed this morning as being positive for H6N1 and negative for H5H7. So the presenting signs that we have seen in these outbreaks has been a significant drop in egg production, reduced feed intake, some mild depression, the green diarrhea that I mentioned, not as prevalent in the outbreak in the Republic of Ireland as in Northern Ireland, just in 1 case, and then a slight increase in mortality. All of the flocks that have been affected here in Ireland have been served with a compliance notice. Once they've been identified as not being H5, H7, i.e. not high pathogenic, they've been de-restricted under that legislation, but they've similarly been served, or simultaneously been served, with a compliance notice under the Animal Health and Welfare Act. And that requires the farmer and the vet attending the flock to adopt certain biosecurity measures in relation to things like the movement of eggs, poultry, carcasses, livestock, vehicles, equipment and machinery, the carrying out of appropriate disinfection, and then the drawing up of a control and containment plan, which is usually drawn up by the flock owner and the vet together. And that specifies measures in relation to how the flock is going to be depopulated, if it will be depopulated. And most of the flocks now, all of the flocks to date, with the exception of the recently identified flock, have been depopulated. It also specifies how litter or manure is handled and treated. So there's quite a bit of detail in those in those control and containment plans when they're submitted to us. Just to say that there is quite a bit of communication by the department in relation to avian influenza, and this is put out by my colleagues in the NDCC, the National Disease Control Centre. A range of information notes and a range of information leaflets which are available on the DAFM website. Okay, so for the second part of this talk then, I'm just going to talk about biosecurity. And I want to tell you a little bit about the national context first before moving on to talk about the specifics in relation to poultry. So we have produced in the Department of Agriculture, going back a number of years, back to 2017, a national farmed animal health strategy. And that contains within it this principle that prevention is better than cure. So biosecurity is a key component of preventing disease. So there's now a strategic emphasis within the department on biosecurity. And that means changing our focus from managing things once they've happened to stopping them happening in the first instance. And that is the new focus in this strategy. At a European level, there is an animal health law regulation which has been introduced by the Commission and the Council and Parliament. And it contains several references to biosecurity within it. A lot of focus again on preventing and eradicating disease, and on surveillance and monitoring for disease as well. So you can see that at the national level and at the European level, there is a strategic emphasis now on preventing disease. Allied to that, then, we will be producing over the course of this year within the department a strategy, a national biosecurity strategy. It's one of our priorities for the current year. And we hope within that to establish a framework for effective farm-level biosecurity in Ireland. We've gone through a process of internal and external consultation on that, and we hope to be producing a document following the final round of consultation by Q3 of this year. It's interesting in the course of our consultation, just to pick up on some of the the feedback from stakeholders. And there's a good understanding by stakeholders that biosecurity includes both physical infrastructure as well as management. There's also a good understanding that there is an internal and an external component to biosecurity, and also a good understanding that biosecurity is something that you must do every day. It's not just a once-off initiative or commitment. It requires changes to the way in which you manage. Farm level biosecurity, as I say, there's the external, how you stop the disease coming onto the farm, and internal, if it does get onto the farm, how do you minimize, how do you contain it so that you mitigate the risks. In terms of avian influenza, it's often been said that the 200 yards around the poultry enterprise are the most important area. So that's looking, I suppose, in particular at the external biosecurity. How good is it? Is there good perimeter fencing, absence of vegetation, presence of footbaths, hand washing facilities, etc.? How well can vehicles be washed when entering and leaving the yard, for example? And is there a facility for disposing hygienically of dead carcasses? Animal Health Ireland, which is delivering an initiative that I'm going to talk about just in the last couple of slides, has done some preliminary analysis in relation to biosecurity of poultry flocks in Ireland. And this is based on an initial look at 58 broiler farms in Ireland. And these plots here on the right show the scores for external and internal biosecurity, and then the overall score. And in each case, the heavy line there, the heavy dark line, is the median score. So it's showing for external biosecurity, we have something around short of 70% score in terms of our external biosecurity, but it's a bit higher than again for internal biosecurity, around 75%. When you start looking at the individual components of this, then you can see again how we have higher and lower scores depending on the specific measures that are being looked at in these questionnaires. So, for example, you can see in relation to the depopulation of broilers that there's a moderately low score around 50%, whereas the scores in relation to material measures for biosecurity between houses is quite high. Just to explain that, as I say, the heavy line is the median. The light line to either side, the vertical lines outside of the boxes, show you the range of scores, and then within the box it contains the two quartiles, the interquartile score. So that's where the majority of the reported scores are falling within those boxes, the coloured boxes. But this is just a very initial look. There will be a more detailed look. The intention is to roll out this measure to all broiler flocks and to all table leg layer flocks as well. And the measure has been introduced as part of the Rural Development Programme, the current RDP 2014 to 2020. It's co-funded by the Irish Government and the EU, and there's a €1 million per annum allocation to it. Animal Health Ireland was awarded the tender to deliver this on behalf of the department back in 2015. And it carries out a range of measures funded by this particular programme. Obviously, the one we're highlighting today is the bottom one there, the Biosecurity Risk Assessment for Poultry. How does it work? Veterinary practitioners are paid to give up to 3 hours advice per farm visit. So the visit is entirely free to the farmer, the cost being met by the EU and by the Irish Exchequer. The vets carrying out the assessments have been trained by Animal Health Ireland to do it and are familiar with the BioCheck scoring system. BioCheck is an internationally validated scoring system, and it's used in many different countries across Europe. It was developed by the University of Ghent. So it's an objective tool. It allows us to put a quantitative score on the biosecurity of any particular broiler premises or table egg layer flock premises. So it's important to say that it's essentially a means of us assessing within the department and across the sector of assessing how good the biosecurity practices are on the farm and putting a score on that. It identifies areas of weakness and it allows us to benchmark and provide metrics back to the farmers who participate. As I say, there's no charge to the farmers. It's free expert advice, and it helps the farmer in the first instance, and helps us in the department to inform our decision making. And hopefully over time it shows progress in the right direction, that we are actually improving our standards of biosecurity nationally. It's important to say that we've put a pause on these BioCheck reviews currently because of the ongoing avian influenza outbreak. It's not recommended, I suppose, that any unnecessary visits would be taking place at the current time. So we have paused them at the moment, but hopefully we will be able to restart them fairly shortly. If you go on to the Animal Health Ireland website, and we've highlighted there over on the right, the TASA button. If you go on there, you'll find the information that you need to identify the vets who have been trained to deliver, normally your own vet. So perhaps the first thing to do is to talk to your own vet, and they can then arrange with farmers to carry out the visit. So my last slide is just some key messages. All types of avian influenza in Ireland are notifiable, must be notified to the department, regardless if they're high pathogenic or low pathogenic. Effective biosecurity is the key to controlling the disease. And I suppose allied to that is the fact that biosecurity is something we do every day, all day when we're on the farm. It's not something that we put in place in a plan and forget about. It does require a change in mindset. And the final thing is that once this heightened period of disease risk has finished, I'd urge those of you who are farmers to contact your vet and to arrange to have a BioCheck assessment carried out free of charge. So I'm going to finish on that and stop sharing my screen, and I'll happily take questions from the Q&A box later.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Joe. I think that was an excellent throughput of AI, the causes, and a lot of points around it. So what I'll ask everyone now, I know there's probably a lot of questions on that session. If you could please just input those questions into the Q&A box. We'll address them at the end when Joe will come back in for the Q&A session. What we'll do now is we'll invite James Greaves in for our interactive session. So first of all, welcome James. Thanks very much for coming on.
Thanks very much, Niall. Thanks for the invite.
No, you're very welcome. I suppose we'll start off. You have over 30 years experience in the industry, and you've worked in a lot of different countries, definitely countries that have had experience of AI. Maybe you can touch on your own experience of AI.
I suppose having farmed in Ireland for quite a while, when Cappoquin closed down, I moved to the Middle East to farm broilers there, where whether I was unlucky or lucky, we got to see some very severe problems with avian influenza, with mortality in some cases up to 70%. And over a period of about 2.5 years, we came up with a series of solutions and methods to get topside of that and eventually get it into single-figure mortality. And what, I suppose, from a practical perspective, how we can mitigate against AI in Ireland and what some of those experiences, or how they could be used in an Irish circumstance. And that's basically what I'd like to talk through now.
Yeah, no, and that's brilliant. So maybe you can start off by, at farm level, why are we seeing increased levels of AI in the island of Ireland at the minute, do you think?
Well, as Joe touched on, Niall, earlier on, the Northern Ireland outbreak started before ours, and it would have happened in a time span where I would have expected that wild birds were probably the main factor. Over a series of months, we've seen our own cases develop, and we've now in June, we've seen another new one, which is highly unlikely to be migratory birds. Okay, we do have swallows and house martins that come into the country at this time. It may be culpable, maybe not, but it's more likely that it's infrastructure, vehicles and people, poor handling manure, stuff like that are most likely the reason, in my opinion, now. Okay,
brilliant. So what can we do at farm level to mitigate against as much as possible? Or what would your advice be?
Again, touching on what Joe said, obviously our biosecurity levels are going to have to get stepped up a level. I think traditionally in Ireland and in England and Northern Ireland, we've been very fortunate. We haven't seen the range of nasty diseases, thankfully, that affect other parts of the world, and maybe our biosecurity standards haven't been quite where now it would appear that they're going to have to be. So I think how we deal with people, trucks coming on our farms has to be dealt differently. I think more and more we're going to have to look at high value sites where you have turkeys, breeders, layers, potentially people showering in, showering out, following the lead that some of the pig industry have taken, and being more diligent like that. Contractors, hauliers, how they deal with their trucks. For instance, I spoke earlier to yourself and Joe in the Middle East. We used to fumigate the inside of cabs of jeeps and trucks twice weekly with a food grade sterilizer and make sure that the aircon systems were taking that in. Cleaning cars and trucks really, really well is going to be hugely important. And also when doing very practical things like when we do wash vehicles, if they're contaminated, it's very, very important. Traditionally, everyone hits a vehicle with a 3000 psi power washer, then we create an aerosol. If there is a virus in that, we're just adding to its ability to move. So we need to change the type of equipment we use. We need to use low pressure washers with high volume. And we have to be careful with the chemicals we use that we don't have an overspill into waterways and things like that. So the choice of chemicals and how we do it is going to be important.
Okay, so in terms of your everyday, let's say, farmers get up in the morning, goes out to the sheds, what should they be doing differently at the moment to lower their chances of
They absolutely have to change clothes. Everything has change clothes, footwear, use the foot tips. Like I said, in high value sites, which if you on a modern broiler farm at the minute is a £500,000 project. Why wouldn't you stand in a shower? Why wouldn't you change your clothes? You know, if you walk from a milking parlour or walk from any other practice, you should take every opportunity to mitigate against you bringing anything into that shed. Wear hairnets. You know, AI has been known to travel inside your nose, in your ears, for days at a time. Oh, those kind of things. By showering, by keeping yourself clean, it's really, really important. And changing, have designated footwear, use step-over barriers, use foot dip chemicals that are specific to the job, not chemicals that break down with organic materials. So it's really, really important that farmers do that.
So you mentioned footwear there, James. Like, is this just a set of footwear for the whole farm, or?
No, absolutely not. Inside the poultry shed, there should be designated footwear. Dunlop in particular make a very good short ankle boot with no cleats on the sole. Your likelihood of bringing material in around the building is reduced. In a broiler situation, all of these need to be washed on a regular basis. But typically in the Middle East, when we worked there, everything was color coded. You one color for outside the foot step over barrier, one color for inside. I think these are very simple things that can help people out. Okay,
and then you mentioned as well visitors. What is the stance on having visitors to sites at this point?
Unless it's absolutely necessary, there shouldn't be any, in my opinion. If you have to have them, take every opportunity to keep their vehicles as far away from site. You can do the extreme, like I said, you can get people to shower in, shower out. I know some sites where if an electrician or vet comes on site, they have fumigation cabinets where they put their tools and equipment in while they shower. Very practical things, but have never been really considered on Irish farms. But given the level of the problems we have and how long it's lasted, I think it's time that people reboot it and start to think in those terms.
Okay, very good. I know, James, you have a lot of experience in cleanouts and cleaning. So maybe you could add in a few words on that and the importance of cleaning sites.
What we found in the Middle East was how viruses travelled with the wind was just surprisingly fast, and how quickly they got from one farm to another. I've seen instances where a house would pick up AI 30 kilometers away, and within 6 days, the house 30k away would be affected as well. Wind blow is a huge problem. A lot of the viruses, according to viral experts that we've had in the Middle East, it travels in the first 8 or 9 feet of the ground. Ireland are really lucky in that we've still got lots and lots of hedges, Cavan Monaghan, the Drumlin type hills, there's natural barriers. By maintaining fences, ditches and foliage around your farms act as a natural filter. So anyone that's got that should encourage to have your fences grow at least 10 feet high and keep them well maintained. They'll help filter viruses out, and this is a proven method. Countries like Brazil and Indonesia, Brazil just doesn't get AI because they plant eucalyptus on their farms. Indonesia clear-felled huge chunks of forest to build farms and then found they had massive AI problems, then replanted the forest and found that it decreased when the natural vegetation regrew and filtered out viruses. But when it comes to clean out, if someone's been unlucky enough to get infected, what we found most useful was close up the house with the manure inside, turn off all the ventilation, close up your vents, whatever you have to do, and douse the house down with a recognized virucidal disinfectant. The best way I've seen is to ensoil the manure in the shed for a period of 3 to 6 weeks. If you can do it for 6 weeks and turn it over after 3 weeks, that seems to be the most effective way of getting rid of the virus if it's in your building. Go all the time spraying it with a mixture of hydrated lime with either sodium hypochlorite, halamid, or even in some cases formalin on the manure when it's ensoiled. If you can get it after 3 weeks, return it over and again disinfect it and then remove it. And all the while, if it's possible to get a large skip in the shed and load the manure in the skips inside the building, then that's a really good method. I've seen that done in Limerick a few years ago when we had the salmonella outbreak, and it contained all the dust within the building. The dust and the feathers here are going to be our enemies, and I would imagine that has been part of the reason why we've had some of the outbreaks we've had in Monaghan. The wind blow has carried the virus across fields to other farms. We need to suppress that dust and keep it down. When trucks are loaded, the trucks need to be washed, the dust needs to be blown, kept down and kept within the site. So the control of that dust and damping down manure is going to be really important. When the manure is out, then it's very simple. Most farmers will be more than aware of what they have to do. Good quality detergent. If you can hot wash, fantastic, even better. And a decent disinfection program. There's lots and lots of really good products there. You've got GPC8, Halamid, Vercon, and always formalin. Whitewash with a chemical in it is incredibly effective with it. When I saw AI in the States, it was recommended by the Department of Ag in the States and also by the military. So it's really cheap, really effective, and it's a good product. I start to see now some guys whitewashing areas outside the houses. So, about a year ago, I was in Russia, and it was standard practice. They whitewashed all the concrete aprons and all the pathways outside their buildings to mitigate against AI and other diseases, obviously. And some of the bigger sites, they do it all the time. They just whitewash everything, outside, inside, outside walls. So it's really cheap and it's effective. Like I said, against many diseases.
Okay, that's brilliant. Well, one thing that you mentioned as well offline before, James, which I thought was very interesting, is how do we lower the attraction of these wild birds to the site? And there was a couple of things you mentioned. As Joe touched on, our housekeeping is really, really important.
We obviously can't have feed spillages. We can't have manure dumped that is attractive to so many birds. I was on a site yesterday, absolutely immaculate textbook site, a £5 million project. There's not a blade of grass outside. And then when you walk around the corner, the guy had a huge population of crows. And you ask why? Because his dead bins, the maggots had formed because the blue bottles have been around in the fine weather. The maggots have crawled outside. And this is an attraction for the crows. So by adding a little bit of lime or a disinfectant or an insecticide, having your dead bins as far away from site as possible removes this attraction. If we have problems where birds are starting to congregate on your sites, Cavan, Monaghan, South Fermanagh are a bit unlucky. They get a huge migration, the biggest migration of starlings out of Eurasia every year. They appear there all the time. It's illegal to kill them, very hard to keep them out. But there are methods through netting and bioacoustics, non-lethal, legal methods to remove them. So most important thing is that we don't have feed, manure, or dead birds. Or shelter areas. That's another thing that people forget about. You get a lot of problems with feral pigeons because chicken houses typically are warm. They have nice places they can sleep at night. But there are netting and very cost-effective methods and easy to install to keep them out.
That's very good. We might do. Did you have any further points or statement you want to get across on that, James? Maybe before I open it up.
No, no. If you want to open it up, by all means do.
No, I think I will, but I think that there was an excellent, very practical guide to, I suppose, how this comes around, first of all, and some very, very practical tips and how to mitigate against bird flu at farm level. So I see there's a lot of questions coming through there at the moment. Again, anyone who's any questions for James, I would invite you to add them into the Q&A bar at the bottom of your screens. So Rebecca, maybe you look through the Q&A there. Joe, I'd like to invite you back in for the Q&A session. So Rebecca, maybe you want to kick it off there?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks a million. Thanks, James and Joe, for both your presentations. A lot of information there for our audience today. Joe, I'll start with yourself. What is the most common source of entry for AI in flocks, and how do we think the current AI outbreak is being spread between houses?
I think, James has probably touched on it, and I touched on it a bit in my presentation as well. You have to think of things that are common, and, personnel and visitors, vehicles, disposal of dead birds, those would be some of the common things that would come to mind from the top of your head. I think we have yet to do a full analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of biosecurity on Irish poultry flocks, but that will come in time. Once we can restart our biosecurity risk assessment, and I see there was a question on that as well, as soon as we judge it's safe to do so, we will restart them. And in that regard, I think we would be waiting at least 30 days following the most recent identified case before we would restart those visits. But there's a lot of analysis to be done, and that will be very instructive to us. I think specifically in relation to the outbreak, I am keen that we would get together with representatives of the sector again to share learnings in terms of what has been happening. There's a lot of knowledge accumulated at this moment in time by the vets that have been involved, by the farmers themselves, and by some of the sectoral representatives. So I'd be keen to, and over the course of the coming days, I'll be looking to convene a meeting where we will bring people together to have that discussion, because my feeling is there's bits of knowledge across a range of people. And because this is not a disease that the department takes primary responsibility for, it isn't an EU notifiable disease, there is a risk, I think, that not all of the knowledge is pulled together. So we want to give a forum for that to be done.
That's perfect. Maybe James, I see one question coming in here. Maybe Joe, you come in as well. What is the risk to humans?
Oh, I think you're better as a veterinary doctor to answer that than me. I've seen lots and lots of people picking up dead chickens and dealing with low path AI. I haven't seen anyone get ill, so I'll leave it at Joe.
Sorry, James. You're right, James. I mean, the human health risk with H6N1, which is the subtype we're dealing with here, is extremely low. I think in the medical literature there may be one reported case of a person, I think in Southeast Asia, contracting disease from H6N1. But I think anybody who's handling poultry should always be aware that there is a degree of risk associated with avian influenza. We certainly recommend to our staff that they be vaccinated for avian influenza, for flu, that they would have their annual jab, and we promote that amongst our own staff. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about the human health risk in relation to H6N1 specifically. But having said that, we do urge everybody to not just get the flu jab, but to use proper PPE, personal protective equipment, when they're handling the birds at the depopulation stage or whatever stage they're at, actually. And just to take, those sensible risks. There is also, as James says, the ability for the virus to be carried in some of these air passages. So, even if there isn't a risk to the human themselves, there is the risk that that human will go back onto another farm and potentially act as a vector for the disease going on to the other farm. So I think we, for all sorts of reasons, we just need to exercise a lot of diligence and care when we're handling poultry.
Perfect, thanks a million. So the biosecurity check and the BioCheck that's offered by Animal Health Ireland is an excellent tool, but just on the slides there, Joe, is 1% being non-compliant and 100% scored fully compliant? Just some clarity on that slide.
Yeah, that's the way that the scale runs, from 1 being very low to 100 being very high. So one of the benefits of this over time is that we, not only can help farmers to benchmark themselves, which I think is the critical thing here. They can see how they sit in relation to their peers, and also internationally, because this is a validated, internationally validated scoring system. So you can see how the Irish sector sits in relation to other sectors. And maybe, James is somebody who has a lot of international experience, and he's pointed to some lessons, I think, that could potentially be learned from other countries. And by using something like BioCheck, we can see areas of strength and areas of weakness for Ireland that we should try and learn from.
Mm-hmm. That's brilliant. So to both panelists, a question in from is, do you think AI is going to become more prevalent in the future? And if yes, why?
I would be worried that it will. I think that climate change is going to have an effect. We're seeing migratory birds do different things. The fact that we have it in June is unprecedented in Northern Europe. And viral diseases, look, we've all lived through a viral issue in our society in the last 12 weeks. It's not that long ago that experts told us that Norway or Sweden, Finland could never get Newcastle disease. And then 2 years ago, 68% of the Norwegian poultry flock either died or were put down. But things have changed. It's not the same atmosphere as we've been lucky enough to farm for the last 25, 30 years and not have these disease problems. So in my view, I think the fact that we still have it in June, unless we take really, really aggressive action and up our game, I don't think it's going to go anytime soon.
Yeah, I would agree with James. I think, potentially it's something that we come to have to live with. The other factor I would put in there would be the increasing prevalence of free-range flocks. So as there's a societal move away from the caged eggs and the colony units towards free range, we will have a greater proportion of our flocks outdoors and in contact with migratory birds. Now, I would agree with the point James was making earlier that at this stage in the year, it's difficult to see the migratory bird as being the issue. The disease has become, has managed to establish itself sufficiently in the flock that it's being transmitted from one flock to another by defects in biosecurity of some sort. We need to look into more detail as to what those weaknesses are. Look, prevalence of free range flocks as a proportion of our total flocks, and as James says, issues to do with climate change. I think we would do well to think of this as potentially something we may have to live with, and therefore we need to up our game in terms of our response.
Just to follow on from that then, the best practice for the disposal of manure.
Yeah, I think James touched on a lot of that there, and within our containment plans that we look for from the farmers that have been affected, we do specify storage periods, currently 42 days for litter and 60 days for manure, lime treatment, and then ensignment or direct ploughing after that period of time. I pick up on something James said as well in relation to transport, and on occasion we do allow the manure to be transported off the farm if there is not sufficient storage capacity on the farm. And where that's happened, it's really critical that the vehicles that are used are not just clean on arrival, but they're also leak tested. So we do ask the vets in charge of these operations to leak test the vehicles, and then to ensure that they're properly covered, so that they have proper heavy tarpaulin covers that are weighed down at the sides, that the vehicle's wheels and any parts that come in contact with the poultry unit are disinfected before leaving the premises. And in terms of where the manure is spread, we currently have a stipulation that it can't be spread within 1 kilometre of any other poultry enterprise. So that it needs to be immediately ploughed, deep ploughed into the ground. So there are, these are issues I think we're finding our way through. We do need to do more work, I think, collectively with the industry to identify where the areas of weakness are, and if need be, then we can modify our protocols and policies to take account of those weaknesses.
That's brilliant. We'll might just take 1 or 2 more questions and then we'll wrap it up. Just one to come in here. The current outbreak this last year has mostly been in adult birds or adult poultry. Broilers has seemed to have escaped it. Is that just by chance, or do you think there's anything behind that?
Sometimes it doesn't manifest itself, or it will be in broilers and you don't see it. If you're lucky enough to have a particularly healthy flock that doesn't get a secondary infection or are not immunosuppressed, sometimes broilers can slip through the net. Particularly now with some of the broiler performance that is currently in the Republic of Ireland, where you're seeing birds go to slaughter at 30 or 31 days. Sometimes they just don't manifest it, Niall, and it gets away. And you see very often in older live birds such as turkeys, layers or broiler breeders, particularly egg-laying birds, it shows up quicker there. It wouldn't surprise me if we've had some broiler flocks that have been affected and have just ended up in the slaughterhouse before any problems have manifested themselves.
Yeah, I'd agree with James on that. It is really, the egg drop is one of the few presenting signs of this subtype of avian influenza that we see, and obviously that's then specific to one group of poultry. And as James says, with the short production cycles now for broilers, it's quite possible the disease has been present on a flock and just not apparent, and the flock has been slaughtered out before anyone would be any the wiser.
I suppose we'll just take one last question before we finish up. What are the criteria that the department deem must be present before they instruct for free-range flocks to be closed in?
Yeah, that's actually, I'm going to kick for touch on that. That's if you don't mind. There's another section of the department, a colleague, Colin McBrick, and colleagues there in the who maintain the marketing standards. So I wouldn't be an expert on that area, but certainly there are implications for the closing up of flocks for marketing standards, the ability to apply the free range label, etc. So there's perhaps something we can post some information back to you on this question following this webcast.
That'd be excellent, yeah.
That's brilliant. Well, I'd like to wrap it up at that, guys. Firstly, thanks very, very much for our panelists, for James Greaves and Joe Flaherty, for coming on and delivering, in my opinion, 2 very, very excellent presentations. I'd like to thank the audience. As I mentioned before, we had nearly 300 people registered for this event, so I think that's fantastic. Just to mention as well, for anyone that may have missed it, this is going to be recorded and will be up on the Teagasc website in a number of days. As Rebecca mentioned at the start, this is a part of a 4-part series. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to be back with Professor Steve Collett talking all things broilers, in particular chick starve. So at that, I'd like to thank everyone. I'd like to thank Rebecca as well, and wish you well, and I'll see everyone in 2 weeks' time.